Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Andrew DeCort. Andrew has been called a dissident theologian by his friends. His work is deeply inspired by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his writing by James Baldwin, and his spirituality by Etty Hillesum. Andrew received his PhD in religious and political ethics from the University of Chicago. In 2016, he founded the Institute for Faith and Flourishing in Chicago, and in 2019, he co-founded the Neighborhood Love Movement in Ethiopia. IFF and NLM have reached over 20 million people with the invitation to nonviolent spirituality. Andrew's taught ethics, public theology, peace and conflict studies, and Ethiopian studies at Wheaton College, the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology, and the University of Bonn. Andrew is the author of Flourishing on the Edge of Faith, 7 Practices for a New We, and Bonhoeffer's New Beginning, Ethics After Devastation. His new book is titled Blessed Are the Others, Jesus' Way in a Violent World. Andrew's words have appeared in Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the BBC, The Atlantic, The Economist, Christianity Today, Comment Magazine, Sojourners, The Other Journal, numerous other platforms. Andrew writes the newsletter Stop and Think. He lives in Chicago with his wife, Lily. And you can learn more about Andrew and all of his work at andrew-decort, DECORT.com. So Andrew, congratulations on all your amazing work, and thank you so much for joining us.
Brian, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and it's a special honor to talk with someone who's worked so closely with Frederick Buechner.
Oh, well, it was my honor too, and thank you for that. I'm really glad that he's been meaningful to you as much as he has been to me and many other folks. So before we get it any further, anything else that you'd like people to know about you?
I love people. I love asking questions. I really enjoy conversation, and I think that thought is unpredictable. When we're deeply thinking, we enter into the unknown together and we adventure and explore. And so I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation, not as a kind of scripted regurgitation of ideas, but as a meeting of hearts and minds and a real adventure.
Excellent. So I've been looking forward to this too for quite some time since we scheduled in. I first learned about your book. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear more about the 2 organizations that you founded and co-founded, the Institute for Faith and Flourishing in Chicago and the Neighbor Love Movement in Ethiopia. So how did those come about, and what are they doing today?
Yeah. So on May 1st, 2010, Brian, I met a 13-year-old boy named Eob who had this atrocious head wound from a cooking fire that he had fallen into as a small child. And he was begging for help, and I had a kind of Matthew 25 moment where I recognized the divine in this suffering child. And after that, I did a PhD in ethics at the University of Chicago. But all throughout that time, I had really felt a calling to return to Ethiopia and work with our Ethiopian sisters and brothers to cultivate a vision that could see the precious value of children like Eob and other suffering people. And so the Institute for Faith and Flourishing is really just suggesting that faith and flourishing are integrated. They're friends of one another. They're partners, that when we go deeper into faith, we go deeper into flourishing and vice versa. And that work really focuses around teaching, writing, mentoring, really friendship, relationship building with people across boundaries. And then the Neighbor Love movement emerged in 2019 in the face of the escalation of othering in Ethiopia. And we define othering simply as seeing people as unrelated or less than ourselves. And this often happens along ethnic, religious, and political lines. And we were seeing horrifying atrocities. A man lynched and hung upside down from a traffic light in a city not far from where we lived, or another man who was brutalized in a city center and then set on fire to burn alive. And Ethiopia at the time was undergoing the largest displacement of people anywhere in the world, more than Congo or Syria or Sudan. And so we wanted to start a movement that would have this simple invitation: the other is not our enemy. The other is our neighbor. The other is someone who is connected to us and equal in value. And we even suggested divine value. And so if you look at our stuff, our logo is a diamond. And we're trying to invite people to see the other as a diamond, someone who has that complexity, but also that precious worth. And the Neighbor Love movement really centers around just a 50-word covenant that we invite people to sign. It's just a covenant to see and treat others as neighbors with value, respect, and practical compassion. And then the covenant gets embodied through these 7 practices that we invite people to practice. So your eyes seeing people as neighbors, your ears listening with patience, even in the midst of disagreement, your mouth speaking with respect and with humility, again, even in the midst of disagreement, your heart letting the other's pain inside and uprooting grudges and resentments, your feet moving closer and walking with people who are different than you. There's 7 of these, but they're all rooted in the body. They don't require money, technology. They don't require a specific religious ideology. They're very democratic in that sense, that anyone can practice seeing and treating the other as a neighbor with their body. So as I write about in Blessed Are the Others, this work actually gets you in quite a bit of trouble. It may seem, relatively safe and commonsensical, but I think including in our American context, when you love the enemy, you often become the enemy, and you can be perceived with suspicion and hostility, and you become the other. So that's some of the kind of seedbed of where this book has come from.
Wow, goodness. So I've loved launching new businesses, throughout my life, but I cannot even begin to imagine what it would be like to launch a new business in another country, much less a place like Ethiopia. Can you describe what that was like for us?
Yeah, that launching something new in another country requires radical listening. It can't be a projection. It can't be an imposition. It needs to be the work of co-listening and discerning what is happening in society and how can we constructively uh, integrate the treasures, the wisdoms, the beauties, the resiliences that already live inside the soil of that society and its people. And so my partner, Dr. Tekele Nega, who's actually here with me now, we partnered in co-launching the Neighbor Love movement. This was not my thing alone. And it really came out of discerning what is this crucial challenge in Ethiopia today? Oh, it's othering. We see it, here, there, and everywhere, from business to religion to politics to just basic social interactions. And then how can we respond to this? Oh, Ethiopia is an intensely religious society, and whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all asking us to see the other as our neighbor and to respond with dignity, respect, compassion, love. I define love, Brian, as will and work for our shared well-being, for our mutual flourishing. And so starting the Neighbor Love movement was really a work of presence, of deep, deep experience. I had 15 years of experience in Ethiopia by that point, and the work of collaboration, cooperation, that unlocks creativity rather than, oh, I've got the solution. Let me try to fix you.
Wow. Wow. Again, that just must be an amazing experience to have done that, and valuable in so many different ways. Before we talk about the new book, can you tell us a little bit about the 2 other books that you published earlier that I mentioned?
You're a good interviewer, Brian. So my first book is Bonhoeffer's New Beginning, Ethics After Devastation. And that book emerged out of really this experience of meeting that boy, Eob, that I mentioned, with that just oozing horrific head wound, and seeing how he had been neglected for so many years. And eventually, we tried our best to save Eob's life at a local hospital through multiple surgeries and skin grafts, but he ended up dying. a few months after that. And that was the beginning of my PhD studies. And I read every surviving word of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Um, there's a lot of them. And I noticed this thread in Bonhoeffer's thought that he was saying there's this terrible storm coming in our society. I mean, since he was like 18 years old, and the church is dying. It's no longer relevant. It's been co-opted by German identity, by politics, by power. How do we start over? How do we begin again in the face of devastation? And that was a question that was extremely personal for
Hmm.
me, not only with EO, but through a political massacre that I had lived through in Ethiopia and through just some of my own personal suffering, many deaths, many losses. Um, and so, yeah, that first book is asking, um, is it good to exist? And can we go through life loving the world? Or in order to survive, do we need to kind of block ourselves off from reality and have this kind of censored experience with others that keeps us at an arm's distance and keeps us safe? And the book was trying to introduce the reader to Bonhoeffer's vision of God and life and human connection and to suggest, no, you can go through life believing that it's good to exist and that the world should be loved, even in the midst of something as atrocious as a Holocaust, a genocide. And then the second book, Flourishing on the Edge of Faith, is really it's the companion to this new book, Blessed Are the Others. And it takes the reader through the one prayer, Brian, the one prayer, the one spiritual practice that Jesus ever taught. We call it the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father. And what I was trying to suggest is that this seven movement practice is responding to seven of humanity's most fundamental questions. And rather than giving us an FAQ or a kind of cold lecture, Jesus gives us a spiritual practice to weave responses into our daily life. So who is God? Our Father, our parent, the one who calls us beloved. How should we talk about this God? Hallowed be your name. Never accept a false familiarity with God. God is always more and other and never under the control of human power. What do you want? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. How much is enough? Daily bread. Give us daily bread. This is a practice of subversive simplicity. How do we begin again? Forgive us as we forgive. Um, and it works all the way to that last practice of can you let go of power and prestige? And that's the moment where Jesus teaches us to pray, yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory. Let go of these addictive drives
Hmm.
to prestige, to power, to control. The climax of a flourishing life is when you can live letting go of these addictive drives to be important, and still live in the rhythm of our parents, that we are sacred siblings with one another, that we're neighbors who pray together before our Creator. So these two books are really, you can read Blessed Are the Others without having read a word that I've written, but these two books are certainly in the background of this one.
And I can see why. And that's just, I love the way that you parsed the Lord's Prayer, and into those, key questions that it answers. That's
Mhm.
really a great way to look at it. So let's get into the new book. Blessed Are the Others, Jesus' Way in a Nonviolent World. How did that come about?
Yeah, so before we jumped on this call, Brian, we were talking about Frederick Buechner, and Buechner, asked, "How do you write?" He said, "You open a vein and you bleed. That's how you write." And this book was written like that. The first chapter is called "A Letter from Me to You," and I describe how 2023 was really the hardest year of my life, in my journey. I'm 41, so I'm getting old for some and I'm super young for others. But 2023 was a really challenging year for me. I was really dealing with some just acute fear of being rejected by people that I love. And that really emerged from 4 years of receiving semi-constant death threats in Ethiopia, character assassination, being told that I was, CIA, an Egyptian spy, a pedophile, a terrorist, gaslighting really kind of chips away at the enamel of the heart. And I describe in that chapter how I felt like a screwdriver was just turning into the face of my soul and mutilating who I was. And that really generated an intense self-doubt in me and this feeling of being incredibly small and
Hmm.
incredibly limp and feeling very, very inadequate and like I was withering. And I describe in the book how 2023 kind of felt like a year-long winter that was cold and gray and seemingly dead. That was also the year that my beloved dad found out that he had cancer, and my dad passed away on April
Hmm.
27th.
Oh,
Um,
goodness.
and so in the midst of this time, Brian, my publisher invited me to come to Bittersweet Collective is my publisher to come to our annual retreat and give a grounding reflection. Um, and I planned to cancel because I didn't feel like I had anything to say. Legitimately. I felt like I had nothing to share with my colleagues, and these are, really high caliber, excellent creative professionals in writing, editing, filmmaking, executives in major media companies. And, I just felt like I was doomed to waste their time.
Hmm.
And really through a process of silence and stillness and listening, the Beatitudes revisited me, Brian.
Hmm.
And I,
Hmm.
I began to be so deeply touched by what Jesus was saying and doing in this first teaching that he gave to launch his public movement, this kind of initial manifesto that Jesus gave at the very gate of what Jesus was about. And it just profoundly comforted me and reoriented me and in some ways resurrected me. And
Hmm.
I shared really the kind of just the little DNA drop of this book at this retreat, this grounding reflection. And in response, my colleagues, people that I immensely respect, again, highly accomplished professionals just began to weep,
Hmm.
um, weep in response to this talk. I'll never forget my friend Samil, who just came up and he just put his face on my chest and he just began to weep. And we didn't say a word to each other. We just stood there and wept together. Um, so this book really came out of the pain uh, of exile, of fear, of self-doubt, of incredible political pressure, and a kind of high conflict, chronic conflict situation, the death of my father, and learning to hear, for some of us, these very familiar words from Jesus in a way that may just be fresh. And I'd like to suggest was perhaps what Jesus had intended all along. So that's some of the background to the
Wow.
birth of this little baby.
Goodness sakes. Since we're both big Buechner fans and are pretty familiar with his work, I mean, as you well know, a lot of his work came out of pain, right? The result of his father's suicide, his daughter's anorexia. I mean, a series of different, serious pain points within his life. And one of his, I mean, you have to think that at least some of the quality and the skill that he wrote came from that pain. Um,
Definitely.
and later on, he was told that by somebody that listened to his talk, and he ended up writing an essay called "The Stewardship of Pain,"
Mhm.
which has been a powerful thing to a lot of other folks that have read that since then. And that strikes me as what you just described that you went through was a great example of being an incredible steward of your pain.
Hmm. That's really helpful. That's really helpful. I don't want to jump the gun, Brian. I want to let you lead this conversation. But, if we talked about launching a business, if you're planning to start something, what's going to be the initial public offering? The first word, the first slogan that comes out.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And let's put this in a hyper polarized, high conflict context, not too unlike Palestine today or Ethiopia today or sadly even the United States today. What would you lead with? And Jesus leads with these words, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the empty, the suffering, the aching, those who feel small, those who feel belittled, those who feel like they're withering inside, those who feel like they have nothing to offer, those who feel like they've become obsolete, those who feel crushed. Franz Fanon, the wretched of the earth, who begins a movement with those words. Blessed are these people, happy. You are embraced by God. You are held by God. Jesus says, yours is the kingdom of heaven. I think this is the gateway to the stewardship of pain.
Hmm.
When we can begin to hear and very slowly trust that we are blessed in our poverty and that this is the point of commencement towards a humanely happy life. That's how I describe blessing as humane happiness, a quality of flourishing that is deeply concerned with the flourishing of others. I think this is a very queer starting point for a movement, for a business, for an initiative. Hey, if you're poor, you're blessed.
Well, but it also helps you understand how it caught on fire so dramatically in
Yes.
that day, right? In the midst of Roman oppression, violence, poverty, lack of any kind of hope. Here was a message of hope and revolutionary. All right. So no wonder it kind of caught on fire the way that it did.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, speaking of the Beatitudes, right? I mean, there's been a lot of books written about the Beatitudes. How does yours take a different approach than others?
Yeah. I can't remember if it was Maya Angelou or it might have been Toni Morrison who said, write a book that you would like to read. In other words, write a
Yeah,
book that you haven't read yet.
yeah.
And, I was raised in a Christian family, Brian, and I, memorized the Beatitudes as a child. But for better or for worse, let the reader beware. I don't remember having encountered the Beatitudes like this before. And what I'm trying to suggest in this book, I mean, that's why I wrote it. And what I'm trying to suggest in this book is that the Beatitudes are not these random well wishes that Jesus strung together to make us feel good, but rather the Beatitudes is an integrated path that is inviting us into a coherent journey that leads to humane happiness or fierce flourishing, a quality of being alive that is ultimately um, radically vulnerable, but not colonizable by human power. And what I suggest is that each of the blessings leads to the other, and that between them, they're like way stations in a journey. And between them is this moment of decision, this moment of crisis where we have to make a choice about the trajectory of our lives. So as we've already said, Jesus starts at this universal place. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Some of us may not recognize that we're poor, but we are. We all begin as babies who can't walk, talk, feed ourselves, defend ourselves without nurturance and care. We'd all be dead. And at the end of our lives, we know the universal trajectory of each of our biographies, and that's that we die. We become frail, weak, like my beloved father. We breathe our last in this world. And in between, Brian, we can go at any minute. And that doesn't, I just learned last week that one of my dear colleagues in the Neighbor Love movement from the European Institute of Peace, he got in a car accident and died. My best
Oh my
friend died.
goodness.
when I was
Okay.
17 years old. That could be any of us.
Yeah.
And then if you look more deeply, I mean, how many of us feel lonely? How many of us feel unknown? We could be hyper successful, well connected, wealthy, seemingly enviable successes. And yet, how many of us deep inside feel this ache of emptiness? And, um, I start the book with a quote from Lady Gaga from her powerful song where she says, um, are you happy with this modern world? Or do you need more? Is there something else you're looking for? I'm falling. In all the good times, I feel myself longing for change, but in the bad times, I fear myself. I think we can all resonate with that. But the first question becomes, the first crisis is, what will we do with the pain of our poverty? Will we allow it to harden ourselves and to try to project this image of invulnerability, this larger than life success, or will we allow our poverty to soften us
Hmm.
and take us into the universal condition of grief,
Hmm.
where we all just can confess, I'm hurting, I'm vulnerable, there are tears inside of me, and that's the next way station. Blessed are the grieving, they will be comforted. And if I could speed up, people who grieve, we discover the volatile emotions that live inside of ourselves. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the 20th century's maybe most insightful guide into grief, she talked about that um, no one escapes grief. And ungrieved grief doesn't go away. In
Mhm.
fact, it compounds and builds and becomes heavy and crushes us and isolates us. And so it's so existentially insightful that Jesus moves from blessing the poor in spirit, those who feel deep ache inside, to inviting us to begin processing our grief rather than being hardened to be softened by our poverty. And he gives us permission to feel what we feel and to discover these convulsive, volatile emotions that live inside of us. And in that chapter on grief, I talk about how Jesus was a young man who wept freely and frequently. He was a guy who was deeply in touch with his emotional life as a trauma survivor, as someone who had witnessed massacres, as someone whose best friend passed away, as someone who had this kind of gnawing sense that he too was going to be killed. But grief, can become radioactive and boil into resentment and vengeance. And we need someone to blame for our suffering, a target to kind of offload this radioactive energy onto. But grief can also make us gentle. In the book, I talk a lot about James Baldwin, and Baldwin has this wonderful line where he says that if I know that my soul trembles and that your soul trembles, we can find a way to live together.
Hmm.
And the next movement on this beatitudinal way, this way to humane happiness, is blessed are the nonviolent. They will inherit the earth. And Jesus invites us to allow our poverty and grief to convert us into a non-violent presence that doesn't try to overcome suffering by impoverishing and grieving others. Again, this tendency to other, Brian. Oh, I feel poor. So I need somebody to be poorer than me. Let me
Hmm.
push them down. Oh, I feel grief. Let me grieve somebody else. Give them something to suffer for. So at least I don't feel alone. And before we know it, we become these hardened, emotionally disconnected, violent people, whether we're just, violent in our thoughts or violent in our words, or we even become violent in our behavior in the cultural movements that we participate in. Um, there's 5 more steps on the beatitudinal way to justice, to compassion, to purity of heart and seeing God, to peacemaking, and then, the final one, Brian, which I don't want to steal the thunder here, but it's being persecuted for justice. It's becoming the other. that when you walk this divergent path that begins in processing your pain, processing your poverty, processing what hurts, and then you allow yourself to grieve, you allow yourself to become gentle and nonviolent. When you walk this path, you're going to be changed. You know, this is not a kind of spiritual trick that it's like, oh, I already knew it from the beginning. And it's just like what I always, you know, a confirmation bias. Like, oh, yeah, I'm good. I don't need to change. I'm happy. Um, this is a transformative journey that does ultimately take us home to our truest selves, but it is transformative. And I've observed, you know, I mentioned these 50 pages of death threats that I've gotten. Um, when you walk this path, even fellow, you know, religious believers, family, friends, you know, they may think that you've lost your way.
Or lost
So,
your mind.
or lost your mind.
I'd like to read this quote about your book from Noah Tolley, provost of Calvin University. He says, "Blessed are the others is a profound and transformative, to your point, journey into the depths of human suffering, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Through personal narratives, historical reflections, and spiritual wisdom, Andrew DeCort challenges understandings of compassion, equips us to navigate complexity with grace and courage, and invites us into the paradoxical joys of Jesus' beatitudinal way." So that sounds very much like what you just described, you know, in terms of what your book is like. Talk a little bit about how your book equips us to navigate complexity, because that's one of the things that I think our society has just seriously lost.
Yes. You know, complexity really means a kind of braiding together of different threads. It's the willingness to recognize, you know, as Walt Whitman said, that we contain multitudes, that each of us is a kind of continent with these different climates and these different landscapes. And certainly, Brian, part of the thread that is woven throughout our lives is poverty. Again, you know, you may have extreme economic poverty where you live in a shack and you eat one meal a day if you eat at all, and seven people sleep in one bed. I tell a story about a family in that situation in the chapter on poverty in my book. But you may be, you know, again, an ultra successful, idolized celebrity who just as much feels this aching sense of lack inside. And I think that this experience of poverty creates all kinds of complex emotions in us. Some of it is shame. You know, is there something wrong with me? Am I a bad person? Do I deserve to suffer? Am I destined to misery? That shame can create all kinds of emotions of fear. Can I ever escape this? Will I be trapped in this forever? Um, will I ever feel like myself again? And, you know, when you start blending shame and fear, that begins producing all kinds of uh, aggressive energies. You know, some of us, again, we direct the aggressive energy inside. So, for example, I've heard a voice in my head at different times in my life that says, Andrew, you're a piece of shit. End your life.
Hmm.
I think many of us have experienced this self-loathing, negative self-talk that is the kind of sharp knives of this shame and fear and sense of helplessness that we can encounter. Some of the aggressive energy is pushed outward, and so we begin looking for an enemy. Oh, it's those illegal migrants that cause us to not have housing, that are taking our jobs, that are making us feel unsafe. Oh, it's those gay people who are destroying our traditional Christian culture with its morality, even as we have hundreds of years of genocide and slavery that we politely sweep under the rug. Oh, It's those Muslim terrorists that are making us feel unsafe and threatened, and that we need this peace through strength to scare these people away from us. You know, when you have shame and fear and aggression inside, if it's not directed inward, it so often goes looking for a target, goes looking for a victim, so that, again, I can kind of offload this because it's such a heavy burden to carry. Um, that's complexity. And I think the reason why we have a reason, not the reason, we're talking about complexity here, a reason that we have this epidemic of loneliness. I mean, the Surgeon General released a report relatively recently that's saying loneliness is an epidemic that's causing all kinds of physical health problems, mental health problems, social disconnection, the thinning of the social fabric. Shame, fear, aggression, that contributes to loneliness. It contributes to, um, I mean, let's look at January 6th. I have this quote, Brian, in my book from T.S. Eliot. I think it's one of the most profound things I've ever read. And T.S. Eliot says, half the problems of the world are created because people want to feel significant. How many people at January 6th, oh, I'm part of a crowd. We're doing something important. We're taking our country back. We're going to make America great again, or whatever slogan it is. I'm just as critical of Kamala Harris, for the record. How many of us are dealing with our unprocessed poverty, our ungrieved grief, our aggressive vengeance by looking for a way to feel important? And then we get on these bandwagons. I'm a Fox News guy. I'm a CNN guy. I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal. I'm a conservative. I'm Antifa. I'm MAGA. All of these very childish dualisms that oversimplify our lives into these, like these billiard balls that are just crashing into one another. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that Jesus' beatitudinal way, takes us deep into complexity with just the first three movements. Have I processed the poverty in my life? Am I aware of it? Have I looked it in the face? Am I aware of the grief that lives in me? Do I know that Andrew's grief often manifests as anxiety? And that anxiety often shows up in my elbow and in my knee and a nervous energy in my fingers. Do I know that? Am I aware that my best friend died when I was 17 years old in a car accident and that I wasn't mature enough to deal with it then? And I'm still dealing with it now. Am I aware that I've looked at countless horrific images of atrocity and that those things deeply wounded me? Because no one should ever see someone being burned alive or lynched. Have I begun to realize that gentleness is not weakness? Nonviolence is not passivity. It's actually a form of rigorously centered, robust, courageous agency that can stand in the face of aggression without mirroring that aggression.
Exactly.
I describe nonviolence as a creative response to conflict rather than a reactive conformity to conflict. You say, Andrew, you're stupid. I hate your book. You're a piece of shit. And I say, Brian, I hear you. There's some legitimate stuff there. Let's have a conversation about this. That's the non-reactive, responsive creativity that Jesus is inviting us into. So when Provost Noah Tolley very generously says that the book takes us into complexity, this is a little taste of it, just with the first three movements of poverty, grief, and nonviolence.
Wow. So, what would you most like people who read the book to come away with?
Oh, it's such a good question. Hmm. You know, I said at the beginning, Brian, that I believe that humans are diamonds, and that part of that diamondness is that we are all complex, like a diamond. We have these multiple chambers in our lives, but we're infinitely precious. And I hope that the reader of this book hears an invitation to process their poverty and to hear the divine voice that says, "You are my beloved child. I delight in you." You don't need to make yourself something important or impressive to be loved by God. You don't need to become invulnerable. You don't need to become uh, larger than life. Just as you are in your infinite particularity, your wondrous perfection, your wondrous imperfection, you know, the mixing and melding of all the glory and agony that lives inside of every one of us, to hear right there, "You're my beloved child, I delight in you. The kingdom of heaven is yours." You don't have to fight for it. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to protect it or defend it. It just is. And, you know, I end one of the chapters with a quote from James Baldwin, where Baldwin says that he says that the great struggle of our humanity is just to accept our humanity, not to fight for it.
Really, really. I know this all too well myself.
I think we all do. I think we all do. And so, yeah, I would want a reader to really begin asking, who am I as a poor person? What is the poverty that lives inside of me? Not as a denigration, not as a belittlement, but who am I as a finite, vulnerable person? And what might it look like for me to begin genuinely internalizing that Jesus says, "I'm blessed, I'm accepted, I'm loved." And so I can continue my journey of doing the grief work, doing the nonviolence training, struggling for justice, becoming a genuinely compassionate person, of having the heart cleansed of any sense of superiority to anyone else. You know, and Jesus says that opens the divine perception. To become a peacemaker, you know, for peace to become our life's work, not a slogan, you know, not an ideology that we put our stamp on, but our craft, our family business as children of God. And then to stumble into the resilience, Brian, that when you don't get, you know, awarded for this, you don't get applauded for this, you know, you don't get a promotion for this. Sometimes you get labeled and excluded and attacked for this way of life, for you to be able to say, "Yep, mine is the kingdom of heaven. Ours is the kingdom of heaven." This is the moment where Jesus says, "Rejoice and be happy because you've become like the prophets." You know, this is when our humanity begins to unveil reality for what it really is, and also point the way to where we can be moving as a human family on this planet. So that's some of what I would hope for is this poverty work and this belovedness.
Well, what a powerful book, and you know, just from your verbalization of the points in it, you know, it's quite compelling. Um, but I have to ask you, I mean, even though you're kind of recently just published this book and you're in the midst of launching it and such, what kind of plans do you have for the future that you can talk about? Are there more books? Are there more businesses that you're going to launch? Anything on any fronts looking forward that you can talk about at this point?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm preparing to publish another book in 2025.
Wow.
It's called Reviving the Golden Rule,
Hmm.
how the ethic of neighbor love can heal the world. And this is a book that, this is a bit of a more academic book, but still an accessible one that guides the reader through the history of neighbor love. Where did this teaching to love the neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself, where did this come from? So I go back to ancient Near Eastern, Greek and Roman mythology and philosophy. Of course, I go into the ancient Hebrew scriptures, and then I walk, from whatever, 1500 BC all the way up to the present. And I take the reader through the whole history of what I call the neighbor love movement, this expanding ethic that is increasingly inviting us to see and love the other as a neighbor. And then this is a secret, Brian. I don't think I've told anybody but my publisher and my wife this, but I think my next book that'll be, a companion to this baby is a book about Christmas.
Hmm.
And it will be a meditation on this, radically podunk, village-based, vulnerable event of a little baby being born in an animal shelter that also has cosmic significance. And who was there? Who were Jesus' grandmothers? That's the chapter I'm most excited about. Who were Jesus' grandmas? And how did they shape who he became? But it'd be a book about how Christmas is for all the wrong people. The outsiders, the the others. So it'll very, very much be in a flow with Blessed Are the Others.
Wonderful. Well, that'll be something for us to look forward to, both of those books. So please keep in touch on that. Again, many congratulations, Andrew, on all of your work in this incredible book. The title again is Blessed Are the Others, Jesus' Way in Jesus' Way in a Violent World. Can you
I
hold
wish
it
it
up?
was a nonviolent world.
Can you hold it up again?
Yeah.
Cool. So please check it out. Go to Andrew-DeCort, DeCort.com. Andrew, again, thank you so much, and really looking forward to hearing more.
Many sincere thanks, Brian, and thanks to all of our listeners. Blessings to all.